We see them all the time, but probably never really stop to think about what they mean. I'm talking, of course, about those weird bricked-up windows you see on old buildings. But they're not just some architectural quirk. They're actually the start of this hidden story about how our rights have been sealed away, literally one brick at a time.
Right? You know exactly what I'm talking about, those strange, bricked-up rectangles on historic buildings. Now, you've probably heard the usual explanation for them, but I promise you, that is just page one of a much, much deeper story about what happens when our access to the world is taken away.
So the story usually kicks off right here, with something called the window tax. It was introduced way back in 1696, and it was actually a pretty clever way to tax the wealthy without having to go inside their homes. The thinking was simple, right? Bigger houses have more windows, so tax collectors could just estimate your wealth by counting them from the street.
And you can see the impact almost immediately. In 1766, the government lowered the tax threshold from 10 windows down to 7. And wow, the response was drastic. In just a single year, the number of homes in the country with exactly 7 windows dropped by 2/3. People literally rewrote the architecture of their homes with brick and mortar just to dodge a tax.
But people didn't always just take it lying down. Up in Scotland, they got creative. Homeowners started painting fake windows on their walls, these black rectangles with white frames, and they sarcastically called them Pitt's Pictures, which was a direct shot at the Prime Minister. It was basically architectural protest art.
The consequences, though, were no joke. As Charles Dickens would later campaign against, this tax had a devastating effect on public health. See, because the tax was on the building itself, landlords in crowded city tenements just bricked up their tenants' windows to save a buck. So a tax that was meant for the rich became this brutal attack on the poor's basic right to light and air, and it fueled outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhus in these dark, unventilated rooms.
And this is where the story you think you know ends, and the real explainer begins. Okay, so the window tax explains the windows. Case closed. But it doesn't explain the sealed-up doors. It doesn't explain why entire public galleries, documented as totally open spaces before 1700, suddenly start appearing in records as private offices or storerooms. What else was being sealed up while nobody was looking?
Okay, so here's the real story. What was being enclosed, what was being lost, wasn't just light and air. It was the very architecture of public accountability itself. The actual physical spaces that guaranteed fairness were being sealed off from everyone. Now, to really get what was lost, you have to see what things were like before all this. Take a look at the Cloth Hall in Ypres, Belgium, finished back in 1304. That number right there, 48, that's how many doors it had on its ground floor. 48 separate entrances, all opening right onto the public market square. Not for show, but for access, for anyone.
And that right there, that's the key difference between then and now. Today, we talk about transparency as this kind of abstract idea, right? But back then, it was literal. It was made of stone and mortar. Any citizen could walk through any one of those doors to see what was being traded, at what price, and by what official standards. And this wasn't just a nice idea, it was literally built into the law. In England, you had a right called the assize of bread and ale. And just look at how simple this process was. If you thought a baker was ripping you off, you didn't need to hire a lawyer. You could walk right into the guild hall, ask for the official weights and measures, and check for yourself right then and there. Justice was direct, and it was physically accessible.
So this is the thing you gotta remember. For centuries, your rights weren't just written down in a charter somewhere, they were built into the architecture of your town. The building was the mechanism. The room was the tool. The open door was the right.
So how did all of this get lost? Well, it wasn't just one single event. It was this slow, sustained process that happened over 3 centuries. You had the Enclosure Acts privatizing land, the window tax restricting light, the guilds getting dismantled, and rights like the assize of bread and ale being abolished. You see, these weren't separate events. They were all threads in the same story, the Great Enclosure.
And we're not talking about small changes here. The scale of this was just immense. I mean, just look at the Enclosure Acts. Over 5,200 of them were passed by Parliament. They converted 6.8 million acres of common land that was shared public space, into private property. That's about 1/5 of the entire country, just transferred from public use to private ownership.
And you know what? People back then, they knew exactly what was going on. This anonymous little poem from the 18th century just captures the feeling perfectly.
They saw the deep hypocrisy in a system that would punish a person for stealing a goose from the common land, but would reward the person who stole the common land itself.
But look, this process wasn't just about grabbing up fields and pastures. It was also about the enclosure of rooms. This was a quiet, almost bureaucratic shift. Open trading galleries became closed administrative corridors. Those public measurement rooms, where anyone could go to enforce their rights, became restricted archives you could only get into by appointment. The locks changed, and access was lost.
And this is the wild part. Whenever someone actually opens one of these sealed-off spaces, they almost always find something that completely rewrites the official history of the building. After the Notre Dame fire, they found a forgotten 13th century screen. In Ben Franklin's London home, a secret anatomy lab. In a home in Ohio, a perfectly preserved stop on the Underground Railroad. The sealed space always contains a piece of the story that we've all forgotten.
So it seems this process of enclosure never really stopped. It just changed its materials. Back then, the barrier was a bricked-up window, a very visible block on light. Today, the barrier is often invisible. We call them privately owned public spaces, and they act as an invisible barrier to our rights.
Let me give you a perfect modern example. Paternoster Square in London. It looks like a public square. It feels like a public square. You can just walk right in. But it's actually owned by a private corporation, and on their land, they get to make the rules.
So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means the corporation can set rules that restrict fundamental rights we normally associate with public space. The right to assemble, to protest, what activities are even permitted. The door might be open, but the terms have completely changed. The enclosure is now invisible.
And this brings us right back to the central question. You see, the most important doors were never the grand entrances. They were those ground floor doors into the rooms where accountability was enforced by anyone who cared to show up. And those doors closed, one by one, so slowly that no single generation saw the whole pattern. So the next time you look at an old building or you walk through a modern city square, just ask yourself, when did that change? Who decided? And what room, in what building, was quietly sealed when that decision was made?